blessings on these gifts and these givers. Let's explore responsive reading number 592 in our gray hymnals. It's a reading by William Ellery Channing, a Unitarian minister. It's called The Free Mind. I'll read the parts in regular font, respond with the parts in italics. I call that mind free, which masters the senses, and which recognizes its own reality and greatness. I call that mind free, which jealously guards its intellectual rights and powers, which does not content itself with a passive or hereditary faith. Which opens itself to life whensoever it may come, which receives new truth as an angel from heaven. I call that mind free, which is not passively framed by outward circumstances, and is not the creature of accidental impulse. Which discovers everywhere the radiant signatures of the infinite Spirit, and in them finds out to its own spiritual development. I call that mind free, which protects itself against the usurpations of society, and which does not cower to human opinion. Call that mind free, which resists the bondage of habit, which does not mechanically copy the past, nor live on its old virtues. But which listens for new and higher monitions of conscience, and rejoices to pour itself forth in fresh and higher exertions. I call that mind free, which sets no bounds to its love, which, wherever they are seen, delights in virtue and sympathizes with suffering. Which recognizes in all human beings the image of God and the rights of God's children, and offers itself up a willing sacrifice to the cause of humankind. I call that mind free, which has cast off all fear but that of wrongdoing, and which no menace or peril can enthrall. Which is wrong in the midst of tumults, and possesses itself, though all else be lost. Blessed be, thank you. William Ellery Channing. If you ever get to Baltimore, you can go to the old UU church there and see the Channing pulpit. It's actually just a regular pulpit, but it's his pulpit. It's famous. We're going to talk about humanism today. Super excited. So let's begin with a definition of humanism from the Humanist Manifesto, the first one in 1933. So a couple of lines. The goal of humanism is a free and universal society in which people voluntarily and intelligently cooperate for the common good. In the place of old attitudes involved in worship and prayer, the humanist finds religious emotions expressed in a heightened sense of personal life and a cooperative effort to promote social well-being. So it's a long way from these declarations to all the way back to the beginning of Christian history, but that's the arc there. And we're going to go on this long trip through time. And the historical events that I'm going to talk about are just my version of the story. It's incomplete, it's frankly arbitrary, and a real religious historian might take exception with some of my views of events. But that's how history works. People make decisions about what to tell, what not to tell. So, what is this question? How did we go from being totally Christian to having humanism be such a big part of our tradition? All right, y'all know the Jesus part, so we're gonna skip forward, right? Maybe not, I don't know, I shouldn't assume. So in 325, there was a thing called the Council of Nicaea. And this was a meeting of people who called themselves Christian bishops in what is now Turkey. And up to now, there had been just a lot of like loose, small groups kind of interpreting the teachings of the Rabbi Jesus. And this group tried to be the first group to create a uniform Christian doctrine. And they came up with this saying, which might be familiar to you: we believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, maker of all things, visible and invisible. And also what they did was they established the idea of a Trinity, that God existed as a Father, a Son, and a Holy Ghost. So the patriarchy being established there too, folks. Only a couple folks who were present at this meeting disagreed, including a bishop named Arius. And he voted against it, and he got banned to Illyria, which is sort of in northern Greece. And I kind of love that the first Unitarian got banned for being a Unitarian. He didn't, I don't think he called himself a Unitarian then, but the lines were drawn from the get-go that, was there a Trinity or not? And there were these constant arguments. And I read a lot of Christian history in seminary at Meadville. Even though it's a Unitarian Universalist seminary, you still got to know the grounding. So as I was reading this history, it really struck me that like the first 1,000 years of Christian history especially are like one group of men, usually men, quibbling with one another and saying, my group, has finally found the correct, perfect, and final understanding of the divine. Until the next group came along and said, my group has found the final, correct, and absolute understanding of the divine, and so on and so on. Changed the hats and the wigs and the trousers, and it was kind of the same conversation. So let's fast forward 1,200 years to when it starts to get really interesting. In 1453, the Gutenberg Bible was published. And there were only about 100, as large as the Gutenberg Bible looms, there were only about 180 copies made. And they were mostly sold to religious communities and religious authorities. There's actually one at the Morgan Library, which is free in New York City. So if you're ever in New York City, you want to see a Gutenberg Bible up close. It's pretty cool. So it wasn't just the Gutenberg Bible, but this was a period where people, who mostly men, frankly, were becoming more of them were able to read. They were becoming literate, and they were reading the Bible for themselves. And literally and metaphorically, all hell broke loose. Because they were finding things, up to now they had always just been told what was in the Bible, and now they were discovering, hey, that's not what was in the Bible. So about 75 years later, in 1517, Martin Luther kicked off the Reformation with his 95 Theses. So the Catholic Church was really a mess then. The primary income was selling indulgences, which is basically if you had money, you could buy an indulgence from the Catholic Church, which would get you forgiveness for your sins. It's kind of like a pledge drive, you church. And, I'm not sure if I can get away with that joke, actually. But there was just, there's a lot of corruption. Priests were enriching themselves. They weren't observing their vows of chastity or poverty, and they were flagrantly partisan. And what I love about Luther, he nailed these 95 Theses to the door of the local cathedral. I love his flair for the dramatic. Awesome. So that kicked off the Reformation. That was the beginning of, the Lutheran religion and a lot of other rethinking, maybe there's another way to do Christianity. In 1553, another guy who did not believe in the Trinity, he was a Unitarian, I don't know if he called himself that, but he just said there was just one God. A guy named Miguel Servetus. He was a medical doctor from Spain. He read the Bible for himself. And he realized, hey, there's nothing in here about the Trinity. And he started to write about it and talked about it. And he got in trouble for it. But he was kind of like a guy who couldn't leave well enough alone. There was a warrant for his arrest. He couldn't stay away from church, so he put on a disguise and went and sat in the back pew of church anyways, because he had to know what was going on, It's like one of those things. And he actually got arrested. His disguise was not very good, and then he was in jail, and he escaped in his pajamas. And anyways, eventually the jig was up, and he was burned at the stake. And they were setting fire to to this, the wood under him, and they're saying, renounce. And he's like, no, there's only one God, I'm sure of it, And the tradition then, this is kind of horrible, so pardon me for this graphic, but the tradition was to kill people before you burned them in the stake, so they didn't endure that. And the guy who ordered him burnt to the stake was a guy named John Calvinism, and Calvin refused to have him killed first. He just sat there, and Servetus begged to be killed, and he wouldn't do it. So anytime you meet a Calvinist, just remember, like, their guy killed our guy. So it makes for some interesting conversations, in the chaplain's office at the hospital. But so we're starting to see this pattern emerge of folks thinking for themselves, sometimes suffering the consequences of that, but just like following their reason, following their conscience, and trying to do their best to like make sense of all this. So that was 1553. 1568, there's a thing called the Edict of Torda in then Transylvania, which is now Hungary. So there's this guy, King Sigismund. He was the king of Transylvania, and he actually was a pretty liberal king. And there was a Unitarian guy named Francis David. And he argued for a decree that allowed local church communities to elect their own leaders. So just like we elect, the congregation ordains its own ministers in Unitarian Universalism, he allowed individual churches to elect their leaders, and in doing so, select their theology. So you couldn't, like, as an individual, just go out on your own. You had to go to an established church, but your church could pick its own leaders. And so what it did was like sanction a radical Christian religion that was, this was just unprecedented as an act of religious tolerance in Europe. It was truly amazing. And there's this really famous picture of Francis David making the case in front of King Sigismund, and he's wearing a robe like this, and it's very dramatic. There's the king sitting over here, and there's a window of the light, of course, shining down on Francis David, and the gallery of people scowling at him. And he's standing there like this in the painting, holding forth, and he's saying this thing that actually he may not actually have said, but it's credited to him, saying, "We need not believe alike to love alike." And that was how he persuaded the king. But especially if you go to an older UU church, somewhere in that church, either hanging on a wall or more likely in a closet, is that painting, because it's been reproduced everywhere. I think this church is too new to have that. Do we have does this ring a bell for anybody? We should get one just for to fit in. Yeah, we have lots of closets. So, these are our spiritual ancestors as Unitarian Universalists. So, religious rebels began to migrate to the Americas, and in the Massachusetts colony, they formed Christian churches, and they had to figure out how to advocate for themselves, how to govern themselves. And they created a really important document called the Cambridge Platform. So this is a long time ago. It's 1648, Massachusetts. They would create the Cambridge Platform. And the Cambridge Platform grants autonomy to each individual church within the colony, but it also says that the churches are accountable to each other. So it's a combination of what we call our congregational polity, our right to, as individual churches, to rule ourselves. That polity also means that we have a responsibility to support the churches and call in the churches around us if we feel like they're straying or need help. So it's purely by coincidence we had the conversation about chalice lighters today, but that's actually straight from the Cambridge Platform. So the Unitarian Universalist Association, UUA, and so we're not a denomination, we're an association of churches. And again, that has that root in the Cambridge Platform. So the other thing is that it began to separate church and state. So the head of the church was not necessarily a local government official. And the governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was not the head of the church in Massachusetts. So that's the beginning of separation of church and state back in 1648. But in Massachusetts, at least, it wasn't until 1833 that local taxes did not automatically go to the church. So can you believe that? 1833? If you paid your taxes, you were also supporting the local church. Wow. All right, so speaking of the 1800s, William Ellery Channing, who we now know a little bit about, he begins to unpack this connection between believing in God or what our focus should be as religious people. So he writes this introduction. It goes like this. He says, "One of the greatest of all errors is the attempt to exalt God by making him the sole cause, the sole agent of the universe, by denying to the creature, and to human creatures, but denying to humans freedom of will and moral power, by making man a mere recipient and transmitter of foreign impulse." So he's arguing for free will. "This, if followed out consistently, destroys all moral connection between God and his creatures. To extinguish the free will is to strike the conscience with death, for both have but one and the same life. It destroys responsibility. It puts out the light of the universe. It makes the universe a machine. It freezes the fountain of our moral feelings." So this guy's creating a little bit of a wedge between us as humans and God. 1838, things start to heat up. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Transcendentalist. So in 1838, the Harvard Divinity School invited Ralph Waldo Emerson to give a sermon at their graduation. Boy, did they regret that. So he just lays it all out about Transcendentalism to like all these new Unitarian Universalist, or actually Unitarian ministers. And he says, a core belief of Transcendentalism is that there is an inherent goodness of people in nature. Sound familiar? Like our first, right on. Adherents believe that society and its institutions have corrupted the purity of the individual. And they have faith that people are at their best when they are truly self-reliant and independent. So he's talking to the people who are like going to be the authority figures for the religious regime. I mean, Unitarianism was much more like part of the class structure then. And he's telling them that people should be independent. This is very threatening. So he goes on to say Transcendentalism emphasizes intuition over science. And Transcendentalists believe that individuals are capable of having completely original insights with as little attention and deference to past masters as possible. Ignore the past, he's saying. So at the time of Emerson's speech, Harvard was like the center of academic thought, Unitarian academic thought. It's where you went to become like a big-time UU minister. So in this address, his comments were super radical, and as he was, proclaiming the tenets of Transcendentalism against the conventional Unitarian theology, he was arguing that moral intuition is a better guide to being a moral person than religious doctrine. He's saying, throw your doctrine out that you just studied and let people feel it for themselves. And he insisted that every individual could figure it out for themselves. And the capper was, he said, you don't have to believe in the miracles of Jesus. So for his efforts, he was attacked as an atheist, which was a very serious insult at the time. So he was run out of Cambridge. But the time we were in, the cultural moment was the Enlightenment. And the culture was changing, and with it, religion. 1859, Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was a Unitarian. We can claim him. He grew up in a Unitarian family. And as he was working on evolution and natural selection and thinking about that, he was very publicly critical of the Bible as history. Because people were using the Bible as science, and he was like, not so fast. So then 1867, things are really starting to unravel fast here. It's kind of amazing to watch. The Free Religious Association was formed in 1867. And this was a collection of Quakers and liberal Jewish folks and Unitarians and agnostics and scientific theists. And their goal was to be a spiritual anti-slavery society, to emancipate religion from the dogmatic traditions that had been previously bound to. We're going to emancipate religion. It was opposed to not only to organized religion, but also to any supernaturalism of any sort. And it was trying to affirm the supremacy of individual conscience and of individual reason. So your heart and your head. So the Free Religious Association carried a message of that humanity could be perfected, we could grow and change and redeem ourselves, that we have a democratic faith in the worth of every individual, again, sound familiar, and that there are natural rights, and we need to affirm our right to use our noggins, to use our reason. And the first person to formally join the association at the first meeting was Ralph Waldo Emerson. Here he goes again. And it caught on, and at the time, there were a lot of these FRA, Free Religious Association members, founders, who went on to form these communes. It was like utopian societies that they tried to start. And there were some, I love these stories in these places, because there's some in upstate New York, in Hopedale, in Massachusetts, and mostly, Oneida Silverware started out as one of these utopian societies. And mostly, these were total disasters, because you get these people together who were like, religious leaders and intellectuals and professors, and they were like had a really good articulated view for a new society, but they had no idea how to farm or stay alive over the winter. And so they'd like kind of hang on for about 6 months, and then it'd get really cold in Massachusetts or upstate New York, and be like, I'm going back home. But Oneida is the exception, because there were people attracted to the leader of the Oneida commune. It just had a vibe. They were more about like being practical people, and there were a couple of them who were really good metal workers, and they figured out the technique for silver plating that had never existed before. And there was this burgeoning middle class because of the Industrial Revolution, so they actually got really rich. They weren't Unitarians. They actually believed in free love, and they tried to eliminate the institution of marriage. Whole other story. It's an owl story, right? So, all right, that was 1867. 1887, the country's changing so fast. By then, there's a group of churches, Unitarian churches, that are in the Midwest, and that was kind of what was the West then. That was the frontier. And they formed themselves into a thing called the Western Conference. And a guy named William Channing Gannett, named after William Ellery Channing, was the founder of this conference. And these folks, because they were pioneer churches, they were really independent. They were just out there on their own, and they're like, hey, I'm getting it done by myself. I'm going to think for myself. So in 1887, they formed in 1852, but in 1887, they met in Chicago, and they decided, we're going to write a new statement of faith. And they wrote this thing. It's called The Things Most Commonly Believed Today Among Us. That's the title. What an unwieldy title. But there they are. So the first two statements are, number one, we believe that to love the good and to live the good is the supreme thing in religion. To love the good and live the good. Nothing in there about God. Nothing in there about God. Number two, there were more, but this is the second one. We hold reason and conscience to be the final authorities in matters of religious belief. We hold reason and conscience to be the final authorities, not the book, not the Bible, not the authority of the minister, or the authority of the American Unitarian Association, as it was then. Wow. So there was one thing I'm kind of glossing over for the sake of time, is how this was received by the establishment. I mean, I mentioned like Emerson was kind of exiled, but there was a lot of people were really upset by this. And the American Unitarian Association was mostly pretty conventional, mainstream Protestant Christian. Maybe they didn't observe the Trinity, but in all their other forms and beliefs, they really looked like Episcopalians. So it was a lot of tension, and there was talk about, is this a schism? What's going to happen to us as a movement? Well, it gets a little more intense. So we get into so that was 1887. We tick over into the 20th century, and there is a person who steps forward as the founder of Unitarian humanism. This guy named Reverend John Dietrich. So he actually retired in 1938. Like, he wasn't that long ago. So he started in a Calvinist tradition. Remember Calvin, our old friend? And but he was a pretty liberal guy from the get-go, and his Calvinist colleagues accused him of being a Unitarian. And he got that a lot, and he got so tired of it, he's like, all right, to heck with you, I'm going to become a Unitarian. So he became a Unitarian minister. And starting in 1916, he led a congregation in Minneapolis. And it blew up. It was such a big deal that he actually his church couldn't handle the crowds that were coming anymore, and he had to hold Sunday worship in a theater downtown because he was getting a couple thousand people. So it was really popular. But here's how he finessed this. He saw humanism, John Dietrich, saw humanism not as a rejection of religion, but as a shift of emphasis. We're still going to do religion, but instead of being about supernatural things, a supernatural being, we're going to focus on human beings. We're going to, instead of talking about the promise of the afterlife, we're going to talk about the wonders and the challenges of this life that's happening right here, that we're living together. So for more than a decade, from like 1969, Dietrich and another guy, a Reverend Unitarian minister called Reverend Curtis Reese, they were preaching what they called humanism to their congregations. And there was this massive debate about having a strictly human-centered, scientifically minded, ethically focused religion. So in 1927, like Curtis Reese, he throws it down. He edits a selection of a book of humanist sermons, and he says, humanists did and do regard themselves as thoroughly modern, progressive, and enlightened. The time has passed, they opine, for theism and deism. They pride themselves in having dispensed with a supernatural God. They're dispensing with God in their religion, and look forward to building a religion with man rather than God as its centerpiece. They hold that the chief end of man is to serve man. So, by the way, I just loathe the gendered language that is all through all this. The fact that I always say man instead of humanity, or instead of saying sort of like tacitly excluding women. So it's dated. It bugs me, but it's history. They redefine religion as the knowledge of man and our duties towards him. Causes, ideas, and goals replace God as the means to redemption and salvation. God is getting replaced. Science, psychology, and political action become the building blocks of the new religion. So they're getting more and more bold. And so finally in 1933, I started out with this, there's the first Humanist Manifesto. So this group of humanitarians, humanist Unitarians come together. And they issue their manifesto. And what they were trying to do was to consciously create a religious faith. So not just a philosophy of life, but a religious faith. It was really a heartfelt attempt to combine intellectual integrity with religious expression. So they never wanted to get rid of religion. They just wanted to, not so much with the God stuff. So here's a couple more lines from the Humanist Manifesto, 1933. They regard the universe as self-existing, not created. Nobody created this place. Humanism asserts the nature of the universe depicted by modern science, which makes unacceptable any supernatural or cosmic guarantees of human values. We're convinced that the time has passed for theism, deism, modernism, and several varieties of new thought. In place of the old attitudes involved in worship and prayer, the humanist finds his religious emotions expressed in a heightened sense of personal life and a cooperative effort to promote social well-being. It follows that there will be no uniquely religious emotions and attitudes of the kind associated with belief in the supernatural. So they're really, at that point, they've kind of arrived. Like, maybe we're not going to say that we're explicitly atheists, but we're just not going to go there. Maybe we're agnostic, I don't know. So there were other manifestos. 1973, there's a second Humanist manifesto. I've read it. Sounds a lot like the first one, but I'll take their word for it. 2002, there's a third one from Amsterdam. I kind of like this language. They say, humanism is a life stance aiming at the maximum possible fulfillment of the cultivation of ethical and creative living, and offers an ethical and rational means of addressing the challenges of our times. Humanism can be a way of life for everyone, everywhere. So I think they're trying to be a little more generous in their language. So this was always, humanism as a larger set of ideas was always driven by Unitarians. So the UU Humanist Association, it was founded in 1962. So it's UU at that point because the Unitarians and the Universalists came together in 1961. And it just was, the idea was to promote humanism in general. And originally it was called the Fellowship of Religious Humanists, then the Friends of Religious Humanism. Then it was Humanist, H-U-U, get it? Humanists, until recently. And like I said, Unitarian humanists drove larger humanist thought. So I'm going to stop the history there for a second. I do see humanism as really a natural response to the gap between what religion promises and our own experiences. So religious folks have always had to grapple with this concept of theodicy. So theodicy is a word for the question of how one reconciles the idea that there's a benevolent and all-powerful God with the fact that there's just so much cruelty in the world. If God is good and can do anything, how is it possible to have so much suffering? And, this idea, it's an old idea, but it only got worse during the 20th century. Once we encountered the Holocaust and nuclear warfare, people really had to ask themselves, what kind of God do I believe in? So, I think that's a big part of what it means, or why the humanist urge has arisen. And I'd also be remiss if I left out an important thread of humanism, which is African-American humanism. So there's a guy named Professor Anthony Pinn. He's like the leading African-American humanist theologian right now. He teaches at Rice University. He also teaches at Meadville Lombard. He's one of my professors. I'm happy to. He's also from Buffalo, which thrills me. I'm from Buffalo, folks don't know. So he grew up in the AME church, very traditional African-American church. He was preaching by the time he was 14. He was on track to be a career minister. Went to Columbia undergrad for studying religion. And then he went to Harvard Divinity School and he lost his faith. He started to examine what he was believing in, and he was struggling with things like theodicy, but he was also struggling with the role of the black church and the black experience. And he has real interesting questions about whether the black church has been life-affirming or life-limiting for black folks. And I'll leave it to you to check out his stuff. He's really interesting, worth talking about. Great guy too, just such a good guy. So, all right. So what are we to make of all this? Well, I think you heard at the heart of this story is this constant cry, let us decide for ourselves. Let us decide. And that's, and that's reflected in Unitarian Universalism's fourth principle, which calls for a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We are allowed to decide for ourselves because of these Unitarians who became humanists. But there's a lot of interesting things here. Like, it seems like at any point, the humanism piece, when you started to center not on God, but on man, like, it could have dissolved into just individualism. And it didn't. So all these folks could have just said, like, I don't believe in God anymore, I'm taking my beliefs and never going to church again. But they wanted to keep religion because they saw the value of something that we do together in common. It's an amazing thing to me. And equally awesome to me, just amazing, is the extraordinary grace to expand the circle of Unitarianism to humanism. So consider this. So for 1,500 years, you're part of a religion that has always believed in God, always been Jesus-centric. And this thread emerges from within your own denomination, from your own ministers, that says, we're not going to believe in God. And it could have been so easy at that moment to say, you're out. Or we're having a schism, or we're breaking up, like so many other Christian sects, But instead, it was the Christians who said, okay, we have different beliefs, but we share values, and we're going to continue to walk together. Think how radical that is to say we're going to embrace the possibilities of a very different set of beliefs and still be one religion. The generosity, the openness of spirit, the really walking the talk that revelation is not sealed, that there's always more to learn. It's incredible to me. Like, how are we not, two religions now instead of one? It's amazing to me. But it reminds me of this great poem by Edward Markham, short poem. He was a Universalist. And it's called Outwitted. And it goes, he drew a circle that shut me out. Heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that took him in. We drew a circle that took him in. And that's what the Christian Unitarians did. They drew a circle to take in the humanists. Amazing. So I guess I'll close today by saying that, unlike the early Christian theologians I was talking about who kept establishing doctrines that were meant to be the final answer, today our religion continues to be open to learning, to evolving, to growing, to saying, hey, we got that wrong before, but now we're going to do better. And as we evolve, as Unitarians and Universalists and Unitarian Universalists, my prayer is that we continue that spirit of generosity and welcome. That as we hold to our core principles, we also draw the circle wider and encounter our differences with curiosity and compassion. May it be so. Amen and blessed be. I invite you to rise and bow to your spirit for our closing song, hymn number 138, These Things Shall Be, in the great hymnal.
Amen.
closing, I want to say, let us draw the circle wider, and wit and love will win. Our service is over. Our worship is over. Our service begins. Let me out of here. Go in peace, gentle people.